I'm Kamila Kudelska. I'm with Radio Poland English section, and today I'm interviewing Professor James M. Cooper, the Associate Professor of Law and Director of the International Legal Studies Program at the California Western School of Law in San Diego, USA. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Camilla.
Thank you. So today we will be discussing two different, but maybe more similar than we think, migration crises. So Professor Cooper, you're an expert on the Mexican-USA border, and you believe that there are things in Europe that can learn from America's lessons on the Mexican-USA border.
Yeah, I'm speaking today at Kozminski University about the same topic, and the title of the talk is what can the European Union and Poland in particular learn from the U.S. And what's going on at the U.S.-Mexico border? And the short answer in Polish is "nic." Nothing.
Nothing. Okay.
No, I'm being facetious, but there's we're not, as we'll discuss, in the U.S. and in Mexico, we're not handling it very well.
Right. So I guess the first question that I wanted to start with was there's a key difference between these two migration crises, and that's that one is immigrants and one is refugees, you can say. So how and why do you believe they're comparable?
Well, what's happening is, particularly at the U.S.-Mexico border, is you have, in the last year and a half, a surge, an increase exponentially of unaccompanied minors from Central America. And those are specifically children who are coming without parents from El Salvador, from Guatemala, and Honduras, and some from Mexico. Not from Nicaragua, interestingly. And they're coming because, or at least they're saying they're coming because they're trying to flee the violence, that they're being particularly targeted because they're being asked to join gangs and they're refusing, so it's putting their lives and the lives of their families at risk. And that they're trying to rejoin family members up in the U.S. Who may have immigrated prior to that, both legally and in an undocumented, unregularized way. So they're fleeing violence in essence, not unlike some of the Syrian, Afghani, and other refugees, Iraqis, who are coming via the land corridor through Turkey and then across to Greece, or from Libya to Malta and Italy. And in those cases, those people may or may not be fleeing violence. Mixed with them are a number of economic migrants, not asylees, people seeking asylum. If they were refugees under at least U.S. law, and the way refugee systems work according to the 1951 Convention on Refugees, which is an international treaty that governs this, and a 1967 protocol called the Cartagena Protocol, refugees have to be resettled ahead of time. So you apply out of country. Okay. If you get to the new country, or new countries, as we're going to talk about, you have to seek asylum, request asylum, meaning that you're looking, and it's meant as a temporary thing, not a permanent thing. But the key issue in both places is among people that are rightfully fleeing because they're afraid of the situations that are affecting their lives, be it civil war or terrorism, ISIL, the Islamic State. Or in the case of the U.S., the Maras, the Central American drug trafficking gangs, they're fleeing for, these folks are obviously fleeing because of the violence. Other folks are mixing in within them for economic reasons. Even some of the folks that are coming from Syria and other places may in fact not be potential asylees or even refugees, if you will. So we've got to be very clear about the legal terms, but we also simultaneously have to recognize that these are complicated issues, and sometimes people leave for both reasons.
Right. So overall, you believe that Europe can avoid making mistakes, maybe with examples of what the U.S. has done in the past on the Mexican-USA border. So, for example, Hungary closed its borders on refugees earlier this month, and it exemplifies the possibility of approaching this crisis through military means, which I know that U.S. has done in the past. So is this one of the things that Europe can learn?
Absolutely. Well, in the sense of how not to do it, or in some cases how to do it. And in the case of militarizing the border, we're not seeing troops at the U.S.-Mexico border to the same degree, but we're seeing National Guardsmen showing up, each state calling out their own National Guard troops. Particularly Texas has been doing that. Likewise, an increase of Border Patrol agents, and we've seen that unfold in an exponential way over the years. President Bush did it. President Obama has done it. We've also seen it with respect to the building of fences and walls. And one of the most famous cases is a privatization process and outsourcing to Boeing under the Strategic Borders Initiative, and it was called SBI-Net, and they spent $1 billion of U.S. taxpayers' money to build a virtual fence, not an actual fence, but a virtual fence with thermal imaging and drones and so forth and relay systems, so that if somebody crossed, they could then send out a Border Patrol agent to apprehend that person or persons. Right. But candidly, we're not sure if it's worked. Well, first of all, we know the Boeing system didn't work because a couple of years ago, finally, Janet Napolitano, before she left as being Secretary of Homeland Security and went on to be the UC president of the Board of Regents of the whole UC system. UC being University of California, where you went to school, Camila, and where I used to teach. We have seen that maybe it's not working because the stats that you hear, and then we have to be really clear, first off, 80% of statistics are made up, including the one I just gave. But we have to understand that, the Department of Homeland Security is saying we're catching less people, so therefore less people are coming. Well, that's not the case. It's like thanking the doctor for the cold you didn't get. How do we know? Right. In fact, Gordon Hanson from UCSD, University of California, San Diego, was part of a commission that looked at the fact that we don't really have a sense of how many people are coming and going. Now, the Pew Research Center, which is the gold standard on measuring undocumented immigrants in the U.S., estimates it's between 11 and 15. They say around 11.5 million undocumented people. I don't use the word illegal because people can't be illegal. That's a kind of a racist, discriminatory expression. 6.1 of those 11 plus million people are undocumented Mexicans, mixing in with legalized Mexicans, those who are there with legal status, but also the Mexican American community. So it becomes like a melange. So it's very tough to get a sense of how many are really there. So we're not measuring it very well. The other piece about the border, or building a bigger wall or even a virtual fence, is that we tend to push people out of the San Diego sector where they're crossing from the Tijuana border really close to the southwest border along the 2,000-mile border that runs between the U.S. and Mexico, or that divides the U.S. and Mexico. We're seeing a more dangerous a push. So they're being pushed into the mountains and into areas where they're freeze to death. And there are thousands of people who have died over the last 20 years or 22 years since Operation Gatekeeper was instituted in 1993. Right.
So do you believe that Europe can learn that this is maybe something that we shouldn't be doing, that we shouldn't be closing the borders, and we shouldn't be putting up fences against these refugees coming in or trying to come in?
Absolutely. There are two reasons. One, every European member state is doing something different. Every European Union member state is doing something different, and there's no coordinated response. And it's almost like a beggar thy neighbor response is like, okay, if you're coming through our place, that's fine, but you can't stay, or we'll just keep you out altogether and push you, as the Hungarians did, pushing folks to Croatia. They can learn. Whether they're going to learn is a different issue, because a lot of these problems can be solved ahead of time. The other issue is that human traffickers, the people that are the migrant smugglers themselves, the estimates are that it's about $1,500 to get someone across the Mediterranean. Okay, and if you're putting 750 people on a boat that should hold 40 people, you're making $1,125,000 every smuggle load. Right. And in addition to putting people at risk, you're not paying taxes. It's a part of a criminal enterprise. We're seeing at the U.S.-Mexico border, the coyotes and the polleros, the actual human smugglers, what they're called in Spanish, they're charging between $4,000 and $5,000. So
what can we learn from these smugglers for Europe?
What we can learn is that we have to actually prosecute the smugglers, and we're not doing that. We're not. The European Union is kind of it's a disparate response. We're not holding these people accountable. Moreover, we should be going after the chiefs of these organizations who aren't on the boats and following the money trail, and that's what we can learn from the U.S.
So you're suggesting that the European Union should be kind of concentrating rather on the not on the end product of these refugees coming into the EU right now, but how to stop the refugees from actually
getting there in the first place.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's two-pronged effort, trying to stop the civil wars in these various countries, which is an expensive endeavor, but it's a highly necessary endeavor. And the other piece is going after the transnational criminal organizations that are making a killing, literally, from this human tragedy. Because the migrants aren't the criminals. It's the transnational criminal organizations who are the criminals.
Right. And that actually brings me up to one of my questions, is that unlike the possibilities of Mexican's economy to be able to grow in the future, or at least in the near future, the Middle East has really, I would say, no real possibilities of developing an economy positively in the near future, so that these citizens will want to stay in the country and will not want to escape. So you're saying that we should concentrate on helping the Middle East be a more safe and peaceful place for the citizens so that they can live there. So how is one of the ways that we can help as the EU?
Well, we've got to institute a no-fly zone in Syria, for example. We've got to cut off, like I'm suggesting for the transnational criminal organizations that are transporting humans across the Mediterranean and through Europe. We've got to go after the Islamic State's financing sources. I mean, if they're still selling their oil, if they're still selling the antiquities, if they're still doing the kind of extortion activities that fund their operation, then we're not hitting the right targets. If there's supposed to have been 7,500 different sorties that the U.S. and its allies have run in the Syrian conflict and Iraqi conflict in the last year since it's begun, we're not seeing the results yet. If we don't see those results, and there are 2 million people displaced from Syria now, you're going to see more and more of them coming. Just like the 67,000 migrants that came, undocumented kids, for example, that came up from Central America in the fiscal year 2014. Half of whom, by the way, have been deported back to their countries, which is the untold story. Okay?
Right.
And the other thing we need to start to focus on are the institutions within the EU and fund them. I mean, Frontex, which is headquartered here in Warsaw, has a budget of something I've seen estimates between 114 million euros a year to 142 million euros a year, and it may change because of the meetings that they had last week with the European Union to try and. I met some folks at Frontex late last week, and they told me they're getting 60 more people, as if that's going to do anything, right? Now contrast 114 to 142 million euros to the Border Patrol. $3.4 billion is their budget. Now, I grant you it's a longer border. It's a 2,000-mile border.
Yeah.
But still, what we can learn from the U.S. For the European Union is you've got to invest in law enforcement. It's got to be coordinated. It took a long time for the Department of Homeland Security to be coordinated because of the post 9/11. You brought in the INS from Justice. You brought in customs enforcement from the Treasury Department. Those cultures don't always mix well. But to put all the pressure on a organization that is, for a large part since 2004, new, Frontex, and yet, and blame them is just A, unfair, and B, it's not helpful. You've got to fund these folks and have them coordinate much better with the various member states, because the member states aren't supporting with enough troops, with enough naval vessels. They're not supporting with a consistent policy in terms of repatriation for folks that are found not to have a valid asylum claim.
Right.
And it's amazing to me, and on that point, you see how many young men of fighting age who are coming over without their families. And they say, oh, we're going to call for our families later. Well, that to me says you're not an asylee, because if you're willing to leave your wife and child in Syria, then how dangerous can it be that you want to leave? Yes, it's dangerous to get across, but it speaks to the merits of the actual asylum application.
Right. So you're suggesting that the EU needs to kind of combine all of its forces and become one union, actually, in order to combat this refugee crisis, kind of like how the United States, you suggested with the Homeland Security and so forth, has.
Yeah, and in a way, the United States is a series of sovereign states, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, to talk about the border states, the ones that are up against and abut the Mexican territory, all of which, by the way, used to be Mexico before 1845. the EU similarly has to start figuring this out in terms of a cohesive response, because to the rest of the world, it looks like a kind of we're in 1943,
right.
and different states playing with the Nazis. Not Croatia, Hungary, sort of. Everybody's doing something different, and there's an ugly head of racism that's being reared, and it's a dangerous precedent. And you combine that with the Greek bailout, and the
right.
It looks like a very disorganized union.
Well, is there anything in the past that the U.S. has done with actually like unionizing Texas and Arizona and all those different states? Because I know that they have had problems as well, not agreeing with how to go about the immigration crisis.
Oh, absolutely. It's politicized there like it is here.
Right. So is there anything that the U.S. has done specifically to try to unite them that the EU can maybe learn from?
Yes. First, the funding issue.
Right.
Reorganizing things so that it's streamlined, and it takes a long time. I mean, remember, the INS post 9/11 renewed automatically 3 of the 19 terrorists' student visas. So, what they can learn, I think, is a common data sharing information that now exists, that we can look at passenger manifest lists on airplanes and see even what people are eating and try to make certain assumptions from that, or where they're flying, how they paid, all that kind of stuff, to see whether it fits with certain profiles that we've created. That's going to be a problem for the European Union because of data protection and privacy rights that in fact made its way to the World Trade Organization in terms of a different approach that the EU has to the US. But I think more information sharing is a key to all of this for the European Union. Just getting to the databases. A lot of folks aren't coming with their documents, or if they're coming with their documents, they're falsified. And even if they're not falsified, it's not like Bashar al-Assad in Syria is giving access to Interpol of their databases in terms of who's an ISIL terrorist, because that's a concern too. We have to give a shout out to national security issues.
So that was actually going to be my next and last question, is that one of Europeans' fear is that among the refugees there are terrorists. And I know that following the September 11th in America, that was kind of a fear that grew too, and they started getting more strict about allowing immigrants coming in.
Except for Saudis.
Well, exactly. So what, if anything, can the USA exemplify for Europe regarding the fear of terrorism within these refugees?
It's a valid concern. It's a valid concern. But the very nature of how assimilation policies work in the various EU states should be of concern as well. And we saw that in France 10 years ago with the riots. We've seen that in London. We've seen that in other places. There are major concerns with respect to national security that are totally valid, that are necessary. But those folks are already there. For heaven's sake, there are already folks who are EU member state citizens that are going over to fight for ISIL. There's not a secret about that either. So these are fundamental challenges for liberal democracies that aren't going to go away. And doing these piecemeal kinds of things, which, by the way, the U.S. has done as well in their immigration policy, because we haven't had comprehensive immigration reform, despite calls for it. And President Obama, even last November, with his deferred action through executive order, in terms of not giving folks who are in the U.S. Some sort of pathway to citizenship, not giving them access to the kind of funding that will get them out of the cycles of poverty. It's what he did was just say, we're not going to deport you. Register, we're not going to deport you. And in 2 years, if there's a new president and he or she decides to do otherwise, now we have at least all your information. Speaking of data protection, that was the deferred action for childhood arrivals, the so-called Dreamers. We're talking about their parents, which was November's discussion, but we still haven't dealt with agricultural jobs, with H-1B, the temporary 3-year and 3-year visas for the tech sector that we desperately need. Our math and science scores, this is no secret, Camilla, aren't so good. According to the OECD, we're number 17 out of, I think, some 23 that were part of the OECD survey a few years back. We need the help with engineers from India, from Romania, from Poland, from China. That wasn't dealt with these kind of piecemeal approaches to immigration. We also have to deal with national security in a much better way, in a much more organized way.
So Europe can learn from what U.S., let's say, hasn't done and how to go about it.
Absolutely. Right. And I should mention what's going on in Syria is also, this is part of a long historical process. You know, France intervened in Syria and Lebanon back in, I think it was 1862 with an intervention to stop a massacre. The constant intervention of Britain and France throughout the 1900s, very similar to what's going on in the U.S. in Central America. What's happening in Central America is very much a function of the U.S. involvement there in the 1980s. And I'm not the first to say this, but it's a very important point that the rise of the Maras, these street gangs that are controlling a large chunk of the GDP of El Salvador and increasingly other countries, and are joining with the Mexican narco-traffickers. These are all functions of the Cold War from the 1980s, right, and the kind of response to the Sandinistas that we saw when they came to power in 1979. This is just an ongoing thing. So a lot of the colonialism and the neo-colonial past of the major powers is playing out in this immigration pattern as well.
Right. All right. Thank you so much. That's all the time we have for today. So thank you for coming, Professor James Cooper, the Associate Professor of Law and Director of the International Legal Studies Program at the California Western School of Law in San Diego, USA. I'm Kamila Kudelska with English Section, Radio Poland. Thank you.
Thank you.